Commander Thexerl stared at the holographic display floating above his desk, watching the daily schedule materialize in shimmering blue light. The cybernetic implant behind his left ear hummed softly as it processed the incoming data stream. His missing left arm, lost during the brutal siege of Valdor 7, sent phantom pain signals through his nervous system. The prosthetic replacement gleamed under the artificial lighting of his office aboard Nexus Station. 15 years had passed since the Great Purge War ended. 15 years since he'd watched his brothers in arms fall to enemy plasma fire. Instead of leading troops into battle, spent his days interviewing veterans and compiling military histories for the Galactic Archive. It was honest work, but some days he missed the adrenaline rush of combat. The station's corridors buzzed with activity outside his office. Nexus Station served as neutral ground where representatives from dozens of species conducted business, traded information, and maintained the fragile peace that held the galaxy together. Through his reinforced viewport, Thexerl could see cargo ships docking at the massive station's loading bays. Their hulls scarred from countless hyperspace jumps, his aide, a young Valdorian named Keshrel, materialized at his doorway. The junior officer's pristine uniform and unscarred exoskeleton marked him as someone who'd never seen real combat. "Commander, your next appointment has arrived." Thexerl's primary eyes remained focused on his datapad while his secondary eyes tracked Keshrel's movement. "Species classification? Human mercenary, sir. Terran designation. He's been waiting in the outer chamber for the past 10 minutes. The commander's antennae flicked with mild interest. Humans had only joined the galactic community 30 years ago, making them relative newcomers compared to civilizations that had been spacefaring for millennia. Most species still viewed them as primitive, barely evolved beyond their single planet origins. Yet their military records suggested otherwise. "Send him in." The pneumatic doors hissed open, revealing a figure that immediately commanded Thexerl's attention. The human stood roughly 6 feet tall, his frame lean but muscular beneath a simple gray uniform. Weather-beaten skin told stories of countless worlds and harsh conditions. His hair, once black, now showed streaks of silver that caught the overhead lighting. But it was his eyes that struck Thexerl, most profoundly calm, steady, and holding depths that spoke of experiences beyond his apparent years. "Commander Thexerl." The human's voice carried a slight accent that Thexerl's translator identified as Korean Earth dialect. "I'm Hyenwoo, formerly of the 7th Terran Liberation Fleet. Thank you for seeing me." Thexerl gestured toward the chair positioned across from his desk with his remaining arm. "Please, sit. I understand you served in several conflicts during the recent territorial disputes." Kane was settled into the chair with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to varying gravity fields. His posture remained relaxed, but Thexerl's strained eye caught the subtle signs of constant alertness, the way his eyes tracked movement, how his hands rested positioned for quick action, the slight angle of his body that would allow rapid deployment from the seated position. "I've served where needed," Hyenwoo replied simply. "The galaxy's a dangerous place for those who can't defend themselves." Thexerl activated his recording device, a small crystalline structure that began glowing with soft amber light. "Let's start with your most recent engagement. The Kepler system conflict. Our records show significant hegemony presence in that sector." The human's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of memory that came and went like distant lightning. Standard planetary liberation mission. The hegemony had established mining operations on Kepler 44b. Local population requested assistance. "Walk me through the tactical situation." Hyenwoo leaned back slightly, his gaze focusing on something beyond the office walls. 3 hegemony battle cruisers in orbit, approximately 2,000 ground. Troops, heavy defensive positions around the mining complex. They'd been there for 6 months, plenty of time to dig in. Thexerl's secondary eyes remained fixed on his datapad, while his primary eyes studied the human's body language. Your force composition? 2 light cruisers, 1 destroyer, 800 Marines. Hyenwoo's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than military operations. "We knew going in that we were outnumbered and outgunned." The Valdorian's antennae twitched with confusion. Standard military doctrine called for overwhelming force superiority before engaging a fortified enemy. How did you proceed? I direct. Assault. First wave hit their orbital defenses, while the second wave landed on the surface. Heian Wu paused, his fingers drumming once against the chair's armrest. We lost about 30% of our forces in the first wave. Acceptable losses. For the tactical advantage gained, the recording crystal flickered as Daxarel's grip tightened involuntarily. His prosthetic arm whirred softly as servos compensated for the sudden tension. 30% casualties would shatter any military unit he'd ever served with. Losses typically resulted in immediate retreat or complete surrender. Acceptable? The word came out sharper than intended. Heian Wu's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes focused directly on Nexril with unwavering intensity. Of course, we needed to establish fear in their ranks. Dead soldiers tell stories that living ones can't. The matter-of-fact delivery sent an uncomfortable chill through the Exril-S exoskeleton, where he'd witnessed considerable brutality during his military career, but something in the human's tone suggested a fundamentally different approach to warfare, the casual acceptance of massive casualties. The strategic use of death as a psychological weapon, these concepts existed outside his understanding of military doctrine. I'm not sure I follow your reasoning, Nexril said carefully. Heian Wu smiled, but the expression held no warmth. When the hegemony forces saw our first wave willing to die to establish a beachhead, they began questioning their own commitment to the fight. Doubt spreads faster than plasma fire in a confined space. The sleep cycle alarm chimed softly in the Exril-S quarters, but he'd been awake for hours, staring at the data streams flowing across his wall display. 3 weeks had passed since his interview with Heian Wu, and the human's casual words about acceptable losses echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. Unable to shake his unease, he'd requested access to the classified military archives. Using his veteran status and security clearance to dig deeper into human warfare records, what he found defied everything he thought he knew about military strategy. The holographic displays surrounding his desk showed conflict after conflict, where human forces had emerged victorious despite impossible odds. At the Battle of Rigel 7, 300 human Marines had defeated 2,000 hegemony shock troops. During the Vega Station siege, a single human destroyer had somehow disabled an entire enemy fleet. The numbers didn't make sense, according to any tactical manual in the Galactic database, but the victory margins weren't what disturbed him most. It was the methods. His cybernetic arm whirred as he manipulated the display controls, pulling up tactical reports from the Proxima Centauri campaign. The battle footage made his exoskeleton crawl with unease. Human soldiers continued fighting even after suffering wounds that would incapacitate any other species. He watched in horrified fascination as a human Marine, missing his left leg below, the knee dragged himself across 50 meters of open ground to detonate an explosive charge that collapsed an enemy bunker. The medical reports were equally disturbing. Human combat medics had developed techniques for keeping severely wounded soldiers functional in battle. They used combat stimulants that would kill most other species, performed field surgeries that prioritized weapon handling over survival, and created prosthetic devices designed for immediate battlefield deployment rather than long-term healing. A soft chime announced an incoming transmission. Veltar's nervous face appeared on his communication screen, the young Valdorian's antennae twitching with anxiety. Commander, I've finished compiling the human conflict summaries you requested. The data is ... unusual. Dexrel activated his office's security protocols, ensuring their conversation remained encrypted. Transmit the files to my secure terminal. The data package arrived within seconds, but its contents took hours to fully process. Report after report detailed human tactical decisions that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The Kepler mining war, human forces had systematically destroyed every piece of infrastructure they couldn't hold, leaving nothing but scorched earth for enemy occupation. Water treatment facilities, power generators, communication arrays, all reduced to twisted metal and fused components. One particular incident from the Orion sector caught his attention. The human colony of New Busan had faced invasion by a massive hegemony fleet. Rather than surrender, the colonists had methodically poisoned their own water supplies with industrial toxins, destroyed their agricultural facilities, and collapsed their underground cities. When the hegemony forces finally landed, they found a dead world that offered nothing but contaminated ruins. The final act of defiance had been the most shocking. The colony's fusion reactor, capable of powering millions of homes, had been rigged with explosives. As hegemony troops approached the facility, the colonists triggered a detonation that vaporized everything within a 100-kilometer radius. The explosion had been so massive that neighboring star systems detected the energy signature 3 days later. They chose mutual annihilation over surrender, Dextrol whispered to himself, his voice barely registering above the hum of his office's life support systems. His translation software struggled with the concept, unable to find equivalent terms. In his native language, the more he read, the more disturbed he became. Humans didn't just fight to win, they fought to ensure their enemies could never recover from defeat. They targeted not just military installations, but the psychological foundations of enemy resistance. Entire hegemony battle groups had requested reassignment rather than face human forces again, citing morale concerns in their official reports, seeking answers. Dextrol arranged an interview with Krexelon, a hegemony veteran who'd fought humans. During the Battle of New Sol, the old warrior arrived at Nexus Station aboard a cargo freighter. His once-proud uniform now faded and patched. Deep scars crisscrossed his reptilian features, and his left eye, had been replaced with a basic optical implant that glowed with dim red light. They met in a neutral conference room. Deep within the station's commercial sector, Krexelon moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been rebuilt multiple times, each step deliberate and measured. His scaled hands trembled slightly as he settled into his chair. "You want to know about fighting humans?" Krexelon said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of old trauma. "Most species don't understand what that means." Dextrol activated his recording device and leaned forward. "Tell me what made them different." The old hegemony soldier's good eye stared past the Dextrol toward the viewport, where distant stars provided cold illumination. We'd fought the Valdorians, the Arctans, even the machine races. Every enemy follows certain patterns. They retreat when losses become unacceptable. They negotiate when victory becomes impossible. They surrender when defeat becomes inevitable. Humans do none of these things. Krexelon paused, his prosthetic fingers drumming against the table's surface. During the New Sol offensive, I watched a human soldier take plasma fire that severed both his arms at the elbows. Instead of falling back for medical treatment, he picked up a grenade with his teeth and charged our position. His medic didn't try to stop him. She just made sure the grenade's timer was properly set. The revelation hit the Ixorial like a physical blow. His own species valued individual warriors too highly to waste them in suicidal attacks. Even during the Great Purge War, when survival itself had been at stake, Valdorian commanders had prioritized preserving experienced soldiers for future battles. They kept fighting with severed limbs, Commander, Krexelon continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Their medics would patch them up just enough to hold a weapon again. We thought they were insane, cybernetic implants. Processed the implications. If humans viewed severe injury not as cause for withdrawal, but as motivation for desperate action, then conventional military doctrine became useless against them. How do you defeat an enemy that treats casualties? Ask tactical advantages? What happened to your unit? He asked. Krexelon's remaining eye closed briefly. We requested immediate reassignment after the third day. Command initially refused, calling us cowards. But when they reviewed our combat footage, they transferred the entire division to rearguard duties. We never fought humans again. The security scanner beeped 3 times before granting Nextral access to the restricted military archives deep within Nexus Station's core. His veteran credentials had opened doors that remained sealed to most researchers. But what he discovered in those classified databases made him question whether some knowledge should stay buried forever. The holographic interface materialized. Around him as he entered his authorization codes, Thousands of files appeared in shimmering blue light, each one containing tactical analysis, battle reports, and strategic assessments from conflicts across the galaxy. But buried within the standard military documentation was something that made his cybernetic implants hum with warning signals. Total war protocols. The classification level was so high that even his security clearance barely granted access. As the files decrypted, Dextro realized he was looking at humanity's darkest military secrets. These weren't just battle plans. They were blueprints for the complete annihilation of entire civilizations. The documents outlined scenarios where humans would sacrifice their own worlds rather than allow enemy occupation. Detailed plans for poisoning entire planetary ecosystems, collapsing star systems by destabilizing their suns, and turning civilian populations into weapons of psychological warfare. The scale of destruction they were prepared to unleash defied comprehension. One file made his exoskeleton shudder with revulsion. Codenamed Scorched Galaxy. It detailed how humans would systematically destroy every habitable world in a sector rather than lose a strategic position. Not just military targets, but schools, hospitals, cultural centers. Everything that gave a civilization meaning would be reduced to radioactive ash. His research had painted a disturbing picture, but he needed to understand the psychology behind these horrific strategies. A name kept appearing in the classified reports: Dr. Janae, a human military psychologist stationed aboard Nexus who specialized in what the files euphemistically called enemy morale degradation. 3 days later, Dextrel found himself standing outside her office in the station's research sector. The corridor was quieter here, filled with scientists and analysts rather than the merchants and diplomats who populated other areas. His prosthetic arm whirred softly as he pressed the door chime. "Enter," came a voice from within. Dr. Janae's office was exactly what he'd expected from a military psychologist. Sterile, functional, designed to reveal nothing about its occupant's personality. The woman behind the desk appeared to be in her 40s, with short black hair streaked with gray and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance. Her uniform bore no decorations or insignia beyond her rank and specialty designation. "Commander, that's Searle," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I've been expecting you." The statement caught him off guard. "Expecting me?" "Dear, security clearance requests have been monitored, as is standard protocol when someone accesses classified warfare documentation. Please, sit. I assume you have questions about human military doctrine?" Dextrel settled into the chair. Noting how the office's clinical atmosphere seemed designed to put subjects at ease while revealing their psychological state. Even the lighting was carefully calibrated to create a sense of calm interrogation. "Been studying human warfare patterns," he began carefully. "Our methods are ... unconventional." Dr. Janae smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "You want to understand human warfare? Most species fight to win territory, resources, or political advantage. Humans fight to ensure the enemy can never fight again." She activated a holographic projector built into her desk. 3-dimensional displays materialized in the air between them, showing psychological profiles of various alien species. Brain scans, behavioral patterns, cultural analysis, everything needed to understand how different civilizations processed fear, pain, and defeat. Traditional warfare focuses on destroying an enemy's ability to fight. Dr. Janae continued, manipulating the displays with practiced ease. "Ships, weapons, personnel. We found this approach inefficient. Destroyed ships can be replaced, weapons can be rebuilt, new soldiers can be trained. But psychological trauma? That's permanent." The displays shifted to show battlefield footage from human conflicts. Dextrel watched in growing horror as human forces systematically targeted not just military installations, but everything that gave enemy civilizations cultural identity. Art museums bombed to rubble, religious sites reduced. 2 molten craters, historical archives turned to ash. "We study our enemies' minds, Commander. We learn what they love, what they fear, what gives their lives meaning." Then we systematically destroy those things until surrender becomes their only escape from suffering. This Fru's combat experience had exposed him to considerable brutality during the Great Purge War. But this clinical approach to psychological destruction was something entirely different. This wasn't the heat of battle savagery he understood. It was cold, calculated, designed with scientific precision. The Arcturus campaign serves as our most successful example, Dr. Janae said, pulling up tactical reports from a conflict. 60 years passed. The hegemony had established a major stronghold in that system, threatening 3 human colonies. Standard military doctrine would have called for a direct assault on their fleet positions. The holographic display showed the Arcturus system, with hegemony forces controlling the strategic high ground around the system's gas giant. Their defensive positions were nearly impregnable, protected by overlapping energy shields and automated defense platforms. Instead of attacking their military assets directly, we focused on their support network. Every civilian transport carrying supplies was destroyed. Every communication relay linking them to home was severed. We didn't just cut off their reinforcements. We made sure they knew their families back home thought they were already dead. The tactical map shifted to show human forces systematically isolating the hegemony fleet. But the attacks weren't random. They followed a careful pattern. Designed to maximize psychological impact, supply ships were destroyed just close enough to the main fleet that the crews could watch their lifelines being severed. Communication blackouts were timed to occur during important cultural holidays when soldiers would most want to contact their families. We broadcast fake casualty reports on their military frequencies. Dr. Janae continued matter-of-factly. Made them believe their home worlds were under attack, their cities burning, their loved ones dead or dying. Within 2 weeks, mutiny broke out among their ranks. They surrendered without firing a shot at our main forces. Dextrel felt his cybernetic implants struggling to process what he was hearing. You broke them psychologically before engaging. Militarily. Exactly. But more importantly, we didn't just defeat the hegemony forces. We broke their will to fight anywhere in the galaxy. They still refuse to engage human forces 60 years later. Entire hegemony battle groups request reassignment rather than face us in combat. The realization hit him like a plasma bolt to his chest. Humans didn't just win wars, they ended them by making their enemies afraid to ever fight them again. Every conflict became a demonstration designed to terrorize future opponents into submission. You weaponize fear itself, he whispered. Dr. Janae leaned back in her chair, her expression remaining clinically neutral. Fear is the most efficient weapon in the galaxy, Commander. It requires no ammunition, needs no maintenance, and once properly deployed, it continues working long after the conflict ends. Why destroy 1,000 enemy ships when you can make them too afraid to leave port? The displays around them shifted to show current galactic military deployments. Dextrel noticed something he'd never seen before: vast sectors of space where certain species maintained no military presence whatsoever. Areas where human colonies existed in perfect safety. Not because of defensive fleets, but because potential enemies had already decided the cost of aggression was too high to contemplate. This is why the galaxy remains at peace, Dr. Janae said softly. Not because of treaties or diplomacy, but because everyone remembers what happens when you make humans fight for their survival. The artificial gravity in Dextrel's quarters felt heavier than usual as he sat before his personal terminal, staring at files he hadn't opened in 15 years. The conversation with Dr. Janae had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of warfare. But more disturbing was the growing suspicion that he'd been living a lie about his own military service. His cybernetic fingers moved across the holographic interface, inputting security codes that granted access to his personal military records from the Great Purge War. The files materialized in shimmering blue light. Each document a fragment of memories he'd tried to forget. Battle reports, casualty lists, tactical assessments, all the bureaucratic debris left behind by the galaxy's bloodiest conflict. But now, armed with his new understanding of human psychology, those old reports began to tell a very different story. The Valdorian Empire had been the galaxy's undisputed military superpower for over 3 centuries. Their warrior culture produced soldiers who were individually superior to any other species in the known galaxy. Vexrel himself had been considered among their finest commanders, leading elite shock troops in battles that had crushed a dozen different civilizations. Then humanity had arrived. The first engagement had been at the Kepler binary system, where a small human colony had refused to evacuate despite overwhelming Valdorian military presence. Standard protocol called for a demonstration of force, destroy a few orbital installations, threaten the civilian population, and wait for the inevitable. Surrender. No species had ever required more than token resistance before accepting Valdorian dominance. The humans had responded by detonating their own space station. Dexrel pulled up the tactical recordings from that battle, watching the grainy footage. With fresh eyes, the human station had been a commercial facility housing nearly 10,000 civilians. When Valdorian forces approached, instead of surrendering, the humans had overloaded their fusion reactors and turned their home into a massive bomb. The explosion had taken out two Valdorian cruisers and crippled a third dot. At the time, Valdorian command had dismissed it as a desperate act by an inferior species. Now Vexrel realized it had been a carefully calculated message. Humans would rather die than submit. The pattern had repeated itself across dozens of star systems. Every human colony faced with invasion had chosen destruction over surrender. Families would gather in their homes and detonate improvised explosives rather than allow themselves to be taken prisoner. Children as young as 10 years old had been found carrying concealed weapons, ready to kill themselves and any Valdorian soldiers who came too close. The psychological impact on Valdorian forces had been devastating. His own soldiers, elite warriors, who had never known fear, began requesting transfers to avoid human-controlled space. Medical reports spoke of widespread combat stress, nightmares, and psychological breakdown among troops who had witnessed human desperation firsthand. But the humans hadn't just been defending themselves. They'd been studying their enemies. Vexrel found intelligence reports that chilled his exoskeleton. Human spies had infiltrated Valdorian society, learning about their culture, their family structures, their deepest fears. The humans had discovered that Valdorians valued individual honor above all else. That the death of a warrior was considered a tragedy that haunted their family lines for generations. So the humans had made sure every Valdorian death was as horrific and meaningless as possible. The battle recordings showed human tactics that defied comprehension. Instead of trying to minimize casualties, they maximized them. Human soldiers would wound Valdorian warriors rather than kill them outright. Knowing that the injured would require medical evacuation and tie up resources, they targeted medics and rescue personnel, turning acts of mercy into death traps. Most disturbing of all, they had weaponized their own casualties. Human forces would deliberately expose themselves to enemy fire, using their own dead and wounded as psychological weapons against Valdorian troops who couldn't understand an enemy. That treated death as a tactical advantage. The final battle at Valdor Prime remained burned into his memory with perfect clarity. The human fleet had been outnumbered 10-1, their ships outdated and outgunned. By all military logic, they should have retreated or sought terms for surrender. Instead, they had done something that haunted Valdorian commanders to this day. The human commander, a woman named Soyoung, had broadcast a message across all frequencies. Her voice had been calm, almost conversational. She delivered words that would end the Great Purge War. We will pile our dead so high that our children will climb over them to reach you. Surrender now, or watch us turn this entire system into a graveyard. At the time, Vexrel had dismissed it as empty bravado from a desperate enemy. The tactical situation was hopeless for the humans. Their fleet was surrounded, their supplies running low, their reinforcements months away. No rational military commander would continue fighting under such circumstances, but rationality had nothing to do. With human warfare, the humans had begun ramming their damaged ships into Valdorian vessels, turning every crippled cruiser into a guided missile. When their weapons ran out of ammunition, they overloaded their reactors and turned their own ships into bombs. The space around Valdor Prime had become a graveyard of twisted metal and radioactive debris, with human and Valdorian wrecks drifting together in a deadly dance of mutual destruction. The psychological impact had been immediate and devastating. Valdorian crews had watched in horror as human soldiers continued fighting, even as their ships died around them. Emergency pods launched from exploding human vessels contained not evacuating crew members, but boarding parties armed with explosives and determination to take as many enemies with them as possible. They meant every word, Dexrel whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the hum of his quarters. Life support systems. His people had surrendered not from fear of military defeat, but from the horrifying realization that humans would literally sacrifice their entire species to win. The Valdorians couldn't comprehend an enemy that treated extinction as an acceptable outcome. It meant victory over their opponents. The casualty reports painted the full picture of human warfare psychology. In battle after battle, humans had suffered losses that should have resulted in immediate surrender. At the Battle of Rigel 7, human forces had lost 60% of their strength in the first day of fighting. Instead of retreating, they had used their grief and rage as fuel for even more devastating attacks on the second day. The pattern was consistent across every engagement. Human commanders would deliberately sacrifice units to achieve tactical advantages. Then, use the emotional trauma of those losses to motivate their remaining forces to superhuman levels of performance. They had turned mourning into a weapon, grief into a tactical advantage, and desperation into their greatest strength. They weaponized their own suffering, Dexrel realized aloud. His cybernetic arm worry as his grip tightened. Involuntarily on the armrest of his chair, the revelation struck him like a physical blow. Every species in the galaxy fought to minimize their own casualties while maximizing enemy losses. Only humans had discovered how to turn their own deaths into psychological ammunition that made their surviving forces more dangerous, not less. Looking back at his own military service, Dexrel finally understood why the Great Purge War had ended so abruptly. The Valdorian Empire hadn't been defeated by superior technology or tactical brilliance. They had been broken by an enemy that fought with the assumption that losing meant extinction, making every battle a war for the survival of everything they held dear. The humans hadn't just won the war. They had taught the galaxy that some species would rather burn the universe down than accept defeat. The archives deep within Earth's historical databases required special permission to access, even for a decorated alien veteran like Dexrel. 3 weeks of bureaucratic negotiations had finally granted him temporary research privileges. Though he suspected the humans had approved his request more out of curiosity than genuine cooperation. They wanted to see what conclusions an outsider would draw from their blood-stained past. The meeting location surprised him, not a sterile government facility or military installation, but a small cafe tucked away in Nexus Station's civilian quarter. Professor Junho had suggested the venue, claiming that understanding human nature required observing it in natural settings rather than clinical environments. Dexrel arrived early, his cybernetic implants analyzing the cafe's layout. From pure habit, families shared meals at nearby tables while merchants conducted quiet business deals over steaming cups of exotic beverages. The atmosphere seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the military installations, where he usually conducted his research. Professor? Junho appeared precisely on time. A middle-aged human with graying hair and intelligent eyes that held depths of knowledge accumulated over decades of study. His civilian clothing marked him as someone who had never served in the military. Yet something in his bearing suggested he understood warfare as intimately as any veteran. Commander Dexrel, the professor said, settling into the chair across from him with fluid grace. Thank you for agreeing to meet in such informal surroundings. I find that discussions about human nature work better when we're not surrounded by the trappings of institutional authority. A service android approached their table, its movements precise and efficient. Junho ordered synthetic coffee while Dexrel requested a mineral supplement compatible with his alien physiology. 8. The casual normalcy of the interaction felt surreal. Given the weight of their intended conversation, "You've been studying our military history," Junho began, once their beverages arrived. His tone conversational, but his eyes sharp with intelligence. "I've reviewed your research requests and security clearances. Impressive access for an outsider. What conclusions have you drawn?" Dexrol's cybernetic fingers drummed against the table surface as he considered his words carefully. "Your species approaches warfare in ways that defy conventional military doctrine. The psychological tactics, the willingness to accept massive casualties, the systematic destruction of everything that gives enemy civilizations meaning. It suggests a fundamental difference in how humans perceive conflict." The professor smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "You're studying our military history, but you're missing the larger picture. Humans didn't develop these warfare concepts recently. We've been perfecting them for thousands of years, fighting each other." He activated a small holographic projector built into his tablet, displaying historical records that made the Exraless exoskeleton crawl with unease. Ancient Earth wars played out in miniature above their table battles, involving primitive weapons but displaying the same ruthless psychology that had shocked the galaxy. "Look at this conflict from what we call World War II," Junho said. "Manipulating the display to show bombed cities and displaced populations, humans systematically destroyed each other's industrial capacity, targeting not just military installations but the civilian infrastructure that supported enemy war efforts. Entire cities were reduced to rubble to break enemy morale. Images shifted to show a massive mushroom cloud rising above a devastated cityscape. The scale of destruction was staggering, a single weapon capable of vaporizing hundreds of thousands of lives in an instant. "Nuclear weapons," Junho explained matter-of-factly. "We developed the ability to end our own civilization and then used it against each other. Twice. When faced with the prospect of continued warfare, we chose mutual annihilation over prolonged conflict." Dexrel's translator struggled with the concepts being presented. The idea of a species developing world-ending weapons and then deploying them against their own kind violated every evolutionary survival instinct he understood. The historical display continued, showing conflicts that spanned decades and continents. Wars where human armies had marched across frozen wastelands for months, where soldiers had lived in trenches flooded with toxic chemicals, where entire generations had been sacrificed to gain mere kilometers of territory. Every human military doctrine comes from fighting other humans, Junho continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer addressing students. "We learned to wage total war because anything less meant extinction at the hands of our own species. When you've spent millennia fighting enemies who share your psychology, your tactics, your willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, you develop strategies that seem insane to species that have never faced such opponents." The revelation struck Dexrol like ice flooding his circulatory system. Humans hadn't adapted their warfare for galactic conflicts. They had simply applied techniques perfected through millennia of interspecies warfare against enemies who understood their own ruthless psychology. The Korean War, the Vietnam conflict, the Middle Eastern campaigns, Junho said, displaying more historical battles. Each one taught us new methods for breaking enemy will to fight. We learned that destroying an opponent's ability to wage war wasn't enough. You had to destroy their desire to ever fight again. The professor leaned forward, his eyes meeting Nextral's with uncomfortable intensity. The Galactic Council thinks they're integrating a primitive species into civilization. They don't realize they're unleashing something that treats every conflict as a fight for survival. We don't have different levels of war, Commander. We only know how to fight like our entire species depends on victory. The cafe around them continued its peaceful routine, families laughing and merchants negotiating deals. While the two beings discussed humanity's capacity for systematic destruction, the contrast between the serene setting and their horrific conversation created a cognitive dissonance that made Dexral's cybernetic implants hum with processing strain. Your species has been preparing for galactic warfare without realizing it, Dexral said slowly, the implications settling into his consciousness like poison. Every human conflict has been training for a war of species survival. Junho nodded grimly. When we encountered other civilizations, we didn't see trade partners or potential allies. We saw new variations of the same existential threats we'd been fighting for thousands of years. The only difference was that now the enemy looked different and spoke different languages. The professor deactivated his holographic display and leaned back in his chair. Most species develop warfare as an extension of territorial disputes or resource competition. Humans developed warfare as an art form dedicated to ensuring our opponents could never threaten us again. We don't fight to win battles, we fight to win the right to exist. That night, alone in his quarters aboard Nexus Station, Vexrel composed his final report to the Galactic Defense Council. His prosthetic arm trembled as he typed, each word carrying the weight of implications that could reshape galactic politics forever. The document began with standard military assessment protocols, but quickly devolved into something that read more like a warning than a research summary. Page after page detailed humanity's psychological approach to warfare, their systematic methods for breaking enemy will to fight, and their fundamental inability to perceive any conflict as anything less than a battle for species survival. His conclusion filled an entire section, each paragraph carefully crafted to convey the urgency of his findings. Humanity represents the most significant military threat the galaxy has ever encountered. It's not because of their technology or numbers, but because of their psychological approach to warfare. They have evolved beyond conventional military thinking into something that can only be described as weaponized extinction anxiety. Every human conflict becomes a war for the survival of their species, making them willing to accept casualties and employ tactics that would destroy any other civilization's will to fight. Recommendation: immediate containment protocols. Humanity must never be allowed to perceive the galactic community as an existential threat. If they do, they will wage war with the assumption that losing means the end of everything they are, and they will take the entire galaxy with them rather than face extinction alone. As Vexrel transmitted his report through encrypted channels to the council chambers, he realized the terrible irony of his discovery. The galaxy's greatest warriors had encountered something that didn't fight like warriors at all. Humans fought like a species that had spent millennia preparing for their own apocalypse, and now they had the technology to make that apocalypse galactic in scope. In the depths of space, humanity continued its quiet integration into galactic civilization. Human colonies spread across dozens of star systems. Human merchants traded in markets throughout known space, and human diplomats participated in council sessions with apparent enthusiasm for peaceful cooperation. None of them knew that a single veterans investigation had revealed the truth that would reshape the balance of power among the stars. The galaxy had welcomed humanity as fellow members of an enlightened civilization, never realizing they had invited their own potential destroyers. To join their community, the report would sit in classified archives for months before anyone fully understood its implications. By then, human influence had spread too far and grown too deep to contain through conventional means. The galaxy would learn to live with the knowledge that somewhere, among the peaceful traders and friendly diplomats, was a species capable of turning any conflict into a war for the survival of everything that existed. And in the quiet spaces between the stars, humanity continued its unconscious preparation for the war they had always known was coming: the end.